Hello and welcome back to another episode of TÄCHES Teaches. I'm Tash, and in today's video I'd like to continue on from yesterday's video and exploring some of the basic concepts behind modular synthesis, but today tackle the idea of waves and the basic criteria for defining them, amplitude, frequency, phase, and then look at a variety of different types of modulation that can occur within these aspects. So without further ado, let's jump right in. I've got a sine wave here, and it's just consistently flowing, and we can see the sine wave represented here on this oscilloscope. The two axes of this oscilloscope, running horizontally from left to right, is time, with the center line being now, and everything towards the left being the past, everything towards the right being the future. And the y-axis, which is amplitude or level. The three ways that you can really define a waveform are through its amplitude, frequency, and phase. And let's start with amplitude here. Amplitude, in other words, is just level. If I were to scale back down the amplitude on here, all we're going to notice is the volume gets quieter. The wave gets smaller until eventually we have nothing. We have a straight line. So this amplitude is responsible for volume, and in an audio term this is the volume that we're hearing, but if we were to use this as a modulation source it would define the amount that that modulation is working upon. Next up we have frequency, and frequency again in an audio domain will have a direct effect, but this time on pitch. If I were to scale this up to 10% more, not only will the wave get smaller and narrower together, but the pitch will go up. So the closer the iterations of this waveform are to each other, the higher the pitch. Or, if we were using this as a modulation source, the more regular it occurs. So let's take this back to zero again. Well, we can look at this wave starting on the zero line, and we have one rise up to 1, and we come back down to 0, but that particular wave cycle isn't over yet because we then have to go down below and up again. And once we get back to 0, we've achieved one full cycle of the wave, and the spacing between a cycle is what then is described as frequency. How fast does it cycle from its beginning position to its end position? Okay, so let me just take something real quick. Okay. The last element that we can use to describe, if amplitude is the level and frequency is how fast this cycles, is phase. And phase is directly linked to time. Obviously, an amplitude, a level, can exist in a split second, and a frequency can be snapshotted, but phase really requires a moving of time to understand. And all phases is where it is along the axis. So whether or not we push it back in time, or whether we bring it forward in time. So if we look at that center line here, and we put the beginning rise there, if I were to take this to be 50% out of phase, if this is the beginning and that's the end, this is the halfway line. This is 50% of that waveform. So I could scale this back to be 50% out of phase by just pushing it until there. So we've now moved the phase of this wave by 50%. If I were to take another one of these, let's duplicate this. So we have two of them. Let's put these both back to normal. I've got to reset this. So now I can put these to be directly in phase with each other. Let's start that cycle like we had it before. So we've got now this sine wave starting on this line, and I can now put these waves in phase with each other. So these waves are now absolutely identical. If I were to mix them, we would probably not be able to hear it after a certain point. I think the oscilloscope is just... I've got to trigger the reset on here. There we go. Let's do this again. Okay, so in theory, it's a shame that they're not showing directly on the... Okay, never mind, go back. So we had here then this wave crossing over, starting on this line, and now we have this wave absolutely in phase with it. If I were to move this wave to be 50% out of phase, I would just start... I could either put it this way, this is 50% out of phase, or I could put it this way, this is also 50% out of phase. If I were to move it so that this line or this line were on that spot, we're now 25% out of phase. Or 75%, depending on which way you look at it. Anyways, that's the basic concepts of a waveform. Let's close this up for a sec, and we're going to have a look here. So, phase in Bitwig, and in particular in the grid, acts a little differently. It is still the same kind of phase that we've been talking about, except Bitwig, especially in the grid, uses phase as not just a relationship of waves to each other, but as a methods for keeping time. The way that I like to think about it is, if you and I were both sat at a cafe in London, and we were talking about starting something at midday, 12 o'clock, and we said that we're both going to do this for a day, a full day, we would both be starting at 12 o'clock, and we would both be finishing at 12 o'clock the day after. We're both running at the same phase cycle, and that's a 24-hour period. However, if I were to be in London and say that I'm starting something at 12 o'clock, and you were to be in a country with a time difference of 12 hours, and you were to say I'm going to start at 12 o'clock, and we're both going to do this thing for a full day, we would still both be talking about the same phase cycle. Whether you're in England, whether you're in Mongolia, a day is still 24 hours. But it just means that you're starting your phase cycle 50% later. So Bitwig uses this sort of as the same approach. I have here some ticks happening, and you'll see that these ticks, 1, 2, 3, 4, every time we get a beep, we're starting this phase cycle again. And this phase line, all it is, let me just remove these for a second. All this phase cycle is a period of timekeeping. It's saying 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock at midnight, 12 o'clock the day after. It's just a period of saying how long a thing will take. And polygrid patches actually have the access to the phase here, and we can define how long we want that phase period to be. If we would like for our phase period to be 16th notes, so every 16th note start a new phase cycle, we can do that. Or if we'd like for it to be every bar is a new phase cycle. This is just a way of defining what the basic period is. So again, if our phase period is 24 hours, for every single person registering that phase will be 24 hours. However, once we start to move to changing phase, right here, I could shift the phase. So again, let's say that we're talking about a 24-hour period, and from the beginning all the way to the top is 24 hours. We are in London up here, and we are in London down here. But if we then move that to a country with a 12-hour time difference, so I'm going to shift this by 50%, you can now see that where I start at midday, it takes half of my cycle before then the new midday starts at our other time zone. In the same way that if I were to do it the other direction, we have exactly the same as what we've just seen, because in relation, all we are is just 50% out of phase. It's also impossible to really tell whether you're 50% early or 50% late once it starts scrolling through. We could put it 25% out of phase, and you can see that now this is starting. If I put this on slow, it'll make a bit more sense. And let's restart these windows. Okay, yeah, there we go. So now we can see that we are 25% out of phase. If I put this back to 0, it's probably a bit too slow now, in fact. What's going on here? Okay, there we go. So yeah, we can see here that we are in phase, but as I start to push this, we start to move out of phase. And this is a way that Bitwig keeps timing within the grid. This phase signal could become a ratio. Oh, we've crashed. So yeah, we could make this phase signal a ratio. So we could say, this is a day, and I'd like for you to do 2 times that phase signal. So if I were to multiply the phase signal by 2 and have it twice as long, 1 iteration of this signal is 2 of these. So we're now fitting 2 of the main cycle into 1 here. Or we could speed it up and we could say fit double the amount into the same space. Or we could say fit 3 times the phase into the same space. Now we're getting 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And this whole scaling is very handy for then keeping track of individual time-based elements. We could also reverse the phase and say that in the same amount of time, I want you to do exactly what I'm doing, but do it backwards. You can see now as we rise from 0 to 1 here, we start from 1 down to 0 there. But why is this useful? What's going on here? Why is this handy? Well, let's go back to our original phase signal. And I'm going to bring these 2 steps modules over. And currently I've just got these doing some sort of shape. For the sake of keeping it simple, let's just fill these all the way up. So you can see that these 2 oscilloscopes are running directly in phase with each other. And therefore, these phase signals are driving the movement of these steps. If I were to remove the phase signal from driving them, they're just stuck. Because, like we've said before, there's no reason for them to move forward. So let's connect them up again. And you can see that they're both running perfectly in phase with each other. If I were to shift the phase out by 50%, we're now halfway through here when this one starts and vice versa. If I were to do 25%, now we're running 25% behind. If I were to go the other way, we're now running 25% behind on the lower one. If I were to reverse the phase signal, you'll see that as this one starts from the end, and they're crossing over now. If I were to double up the speed here and have it happen twice as fast, you can now see that we're fitting 2 full phase cycles into 1 cycle here. Or if I were to do it 3 times, you can now see that we're filling 3 in with the amount of time it takes to use this. So this is very handy if, say, let's bring this down to something a bit more logical, say like 8 steps. Turn it off interpolation as well. We'll just go for blah, 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 blah. If you're then running sequences against each other and you're then trying to calculate how fast they should go in comparison to each other by using ratios of phase, we can then create in-time variations. Phase is also quite handy because it's always given a specific value. Instead of having it on fast mode here where we can see it scaling up like a triangle, I've got it on pitch, which is just a very, very close value. And we can see here the readout of that phase at any given instance. Come on, move. So we can see that once it starts at this 0 line, we get a value of 0. And it goes all the way up to almost 1, 99999, and then comes back down again. Which means that at any given instant, we can ask the phase, where are you? And if we say, well, tell me when we reach 0, tell me, it will go, now. Now. Or tell me when we reach a value of 0.5, it will say, now. And because of that, phase can be a very handy way of sequencing things, or, again, keeping track of time. Because phase, especially in the DAW, is perfect. It will just continue to run like a good Swiss watch. Therefore, using some simple comparations or using some simple maths, we can say that when the phase is equal to 0, let's bring it just over here for now. So we can say when the output of this phase equals 0, let's remove that for a sec, let's just go straight in. When the output of this phase equals 0, then do something. And because we're saying, you can see here that as the phase gets almost to the top, it then flashes, and that little flash indicates that it's equaling 0. Therefore, we're going to take that equals, and we're going to say when it equals 0, trigger this kick drum. So let me just turn the volumes down on these guys for a sec, and let's have a listen. There we go. And you can see here that this phase signal when that gets all the way down to 0, we're then triggering a kick. For some reason it's gone off of that nice view I had. I'll just look like that. Cool, so we're getting a kick happening on the 0. What if we want a kick on both the 1 and the 2? In that case, I'm going to say, well, what about having a kick on 0 and 0.5? So I'm going to compare the same phase signal and say, okay, is it equal to 0? If so, send a gate output. But if it's equal to 0.5, also send a gate output. So we're sending it into here and saying, if it's 0 or 0.5, send us a gate. So now, speed that up a bit. Cool. So we're now getting a kick on every bit downbeat. So we could also say that maybe send a clap on that second beat. So we know that that's 0.5. That's half of the way through. So let's compare the phase and say when the phase is equal to 50, 0.5, send a gate output for the clap. Which just means if we wanted to do offbeat hats, what's in between 0, 0.5 and 1 would be 0.25 and 0.75. So again, let's compare the output of that phase signal and say when it's equal to 0.25, when it's equal to 0.75, either of those trigger this hat. So again, all we're using here is a phase signal to define when something's happening. And you can see this value here. If I were to slow it down a huge amount, we can see so phase is a great way of keeping time, and by using comparations and maths in comparing or evaluating phase, we can do a lot of cool things. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is the variety of modulations. If we go back to our original little screen here, we talked about amplitude, i.e. level, we talked about frequency, pitch or speed, and we talked about phase, which is relationship of where it is across the time axis and where it is in time. So let's have a look at the different types of modulation. I'm going to start with what is often called frequency modulation. In a lot of synthesizers and a lot of VSTs, they refer to something as FM, or frequency modulation. And what frequency modulation is when you take the... Let's have a look here. Okay, so I've got a sine wave coming through here. And the confusing thing is that frequency modulation is not actually frequency modulation, it's phase modulation. In fact, it's probably best to talk about frequency modulation first. So we're going to go to frequency modulation. Okay, so frequency modulation in any form is creating a consistent movement directed at a certain factor over time to change the results of a specific waveform. So we have here a sine wave. What frequency modulation is basically moving the pitch, changing the frequency. Bearing in mind the frequency is how close together the waveform is. If we were to do that really fast, we're going to end up with something called frequency modulation. So to demonstrate, I'm going to use this LFO to change the speed, so to change the pitch, sorry. We're going to go, let's do up 2 octaves. So we're going to have this LFO change the pitch up and down by 2 octaves. Okay, up and down by 2 octaves really fast. So let's have a look what happens as we start to do that. Let's change that instead of being 2 octaves to just be 1. So there we have our sine wave, but as we start to slowly bring in this... Oh, there we go. That's changing the pitch up and down very quickly, but it's still not fast enough that it's become one unified tone. Sine. So it's a shame we can't slow this down anymore. But basically all that is just changing the pitch of something so fast up and down at a consistent speed that there becomes these harmonics that just come through. So that is frequency modulation. What a lot of these synths and VSTs have called frequency modulation is actually phase modulation. And I think it was Yamaha who first started calling what I'm about to show you now FM, but what they were actually doing was modifying the phase. So let's have a look here. We've got our sine wave, and this sine wave is behaving as it is. If we were to send through another sine wave, and we were to use this sine wave as a means of moving... Okay, let's take this shift again. In fact, let's use that there. So we can shift the phase of this signal, as we talked about. If we were to automate the shifting of this, if we were to say, play that sine wave, but move it back in time and move it forward in time at a consistent rate, that's going to create periods of the wave being wider and periods of the wave being shorter. And that's just because of a consistent time of slowing something down while it's staying the same speed and then speeding something up forward. Let's have a look how that relates here then. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this sine wave and we're going to use this sine wave to modulate the movement back and forth. So as we were doing here, we're going to move this back and forth, but at the speed of a sine wave. We're going to slowly bring it in. And look what happens to the waveform. Now this may make a bit more sense if we were to use a very slow LFO. Let's take this sine wave, for example, and we'll go to kilohertz. So as we start to bring up the speed on here, actually let's go to just hertz. Look what's happening. We're getting pushed back and forth. And as we start to speed that up, we're getting a subtle pitch change. So even though the pitch is staying the same, we're not changing the note. By changing the phase over time and repeatedly moving it, we're starting to get a rather curious effect. It's almost like a tremolo, or a vibrato, sorry. And as we start to really start bringing this up into the audio range, let's now take it to kilohertz. We start to create a really unusual sound. And if we take back to this regular sine wave, we're now modulating this sine wave with exactly the same source. So it's basically modulating itself. So as we now bring that phase modulation in, what if we change the phase of the wave modulating it? Because currently it's being modulated by a wave identical to itself. If we then shift the phase of the modulator, we're then creating even more change to that wave. So what if we were to then automate this movement within the wave so that the actual wave modulating so that the wave being modulated is being modulated by a wave that is having its phase modulated. Let's take this LFO here, and we'll make it so that it's just going to be moving forward. It's the equivalent of me moving it here and then instantly back. And look at that. So that's phase modulation, with the modulator being phase modulated by an LFO. And if we were to start to bring this into the audio range, it's all just very weird. So let's go back to that. Okay, so that's phase modulation. It's the moving of a wave back and forth in time while it continues to stay the same pitch. And the last one is AM, or amplitude modulation. And this one's really quite simple to understand, because let's take our pitch. Okay, so as I bring the amplitude down, we can see that the wave gets smaller. As I bring it up, it gets louder. And if I had to do this fast, I can't do it fast enough, but we start to create these extra harmonics, because what's going to be happening is, despite the main signal going up and down, within the time it goes up and down, it's going to be added to this period of wiggles down, up and down as well. So let's take this LFO here, and we're going to use that to bring the volume all the way down on this waveform. And as I start to bring the volume, let's start at hertz. As I start to slowly bring the volume up and down, we just hear a sort of a tremolo. But as it gets faster, we then start to get a rather unusual tone coming through. Let's try kilohertz now. And it's not long before we get some really rather unusual tones, because you can see the waveform stays the same, but we're adding, within those periods, extra movement. Until we bring it all the way back down to 0. So that's amplitude modulation. And I think that about covers it for today's quick chat on waves and the characteristics of those waves, and some of the forms of modulation that can occur between those features. I will be talking some more about this in the next few days, where I'm going to start going a bit deeper into some of the specific module types and how they work together. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you have any questions or desires for future videos. I am a Bitwig certified trainer, in case you're interested for any one-on-one lessons. You can follow the link down in my description to go through to my website. And as always, happy Friday and happy creating.